Welcome to Digital Hauntology, a channel where I write about video games. This is a follow-up to my last video on Alan Wake. Originally, it was just my intention to make a video on Alan Wake 2, but when I was writing that script, I kept finding myself in this weird situation where I was going off on lengthy tangents, explaining concepts and story beats from previous Remedy games to the point where it felt like I was talking more about those titles than Alan Wake 2 altogether. And that is because in a lot of ways, Alan Wake 2 feels like the culmination of Remedy's last 13 years of design philosophy, world building, and presentation. So instead of just making one video on Alan Wake 2, which would have featured tons of sidebars, distractions, clarifications, as well as, just becoming ridiculously long, I've ultimately decided to make a 4-part series on Remedy's games that tie directly into this most recent entry. The first was on Alan Wake and its 2 DLC chapters. This one will be on Alan Wake's American Nightmare, then Control, and then finally Remedy's 2023 release. And eagle-eyed viewers will probably catch that I left Quantum Break out of this list, as well as skipping over some of the studio's earlier entries. But I've already covered Shawn Ashmore's time-traveling adventure in a previous video, and while I will eventually cover things like Max Payne in the future, I feel like this little series will ultimately cover most of what I am getting at in terms of how they influenced Alan Wake 2. So with that said, on to the main topic of this video, but keep in mind there will be some pretty heavy spoilers from here on out, so consider yourself warned if that's the kind of thing that you care about. So, Alan Wake's American Nightmare. With development of the first game completed, the title shipped, and even supported with its DLC, Remedy began ramping up for their next project. And although American Nightmare was the next project that they released, Remedy had actually set its sights on something far more ambitious. The team had begun fleshing out the plot, art style, concepts, and core design of a proper sequel. And with assets from the first Alan Wake, an engine to run everything on, as well as the first game acting as a foundation and style guide of sorts, Remedy began working on a vertical slice of what the 2010s version of Alan Wake 2 would have been, with the team going as far as developing what we now know as the Alan Wake 2 prototype. A prototype that was shown internally to Microsoft as well as reportedly shown to other potential publishers before ultimately failing to get the green light. Made public in 2015 through Brian Crescenti's Polygon feature introducing the Alan Wake 2 You Will Never Play. Concept art, insight from Sam Lake on Alan Wake's original structure being written around the idea that it would have a sequel with some of its future narrative beats already mapped out when the first game was made. And most importantly, video footage of Remedy's 2010 prototype complete with annotations from the studio and Polygon were all made public for the first time. This 13.5-minute video showed us a few key features of what would have been in this follow-up to Alan Wake. First, this demo of sorts was placed in the Arizona desert, and Alan explains through presumably an early draft of Return that there are places in the real world where fiction and dreams can come true, and that Mr. Scratch, the entity introduced to us at the end of the first game by the Diver, which is functionally Alan's doppelganger, is after Alan's wife Alice and has tracked her down to a motel off the interstate, with the action in this prototype showcasing Alan trying to get to her before Scratch can. In terms of game design, this prototype is definitely utilizing the first Alan Wake as its foundation, with similar weaponry, the same burning the shadows off the Taken mechanic, as well as the same slow motion effect found in killing blows and perfect dodges. But where things differ from the first game are in the introduction of a new enemy type, the Birdman, which utilizes the same Hitchcock-inspired enemies from the first title, but now instead of just acting as a murder of deadly crows that just make a beeline for the author, these birds now coalesce on the ground into a single Taken before ripping apart again and flying around the player. Enemies in general seem more aggressive and more intelligent, as they are seen shambling over cars in order to get to Alan, and they are even seen interacting with the environment in specific ways, such as pulling a fire axe off of the front of a fire engine, and in one particular sequence, a Taken is seen ripping a car door from a vehicle and using it as a makeshift shield as it advances on the player. And while these are definitely improvements over the first game, it does seem, at least from this early glance, that Remedy was putting even more of an emphasis on the action component of this action horror franchise. But when it comes to the more psychological thriller aspects that were all over the place in the first game, it looks like the manuscript pages were still going to be the method in which Alan's voiceover narrative was presented to the player. But now in this prototype, these manuscript pages function less like potential spoilers meant to ratchet up the dread like they were in the first game, and more like instructions for Alan to use his fiction in order to rewrite reality. Upon picking up a typewritten page, now shown in a more stylized manner than the first game, Alan reads about a wrecked semi-truck clearing the blocked-off bridge that he is now in front of. But certain details on this page, they don't quite match up with this current setting. And these pages now influence the gameplay, as manipulating the setting in order to make the events on the page come true seems to be a major mechanic, or at least it was in this prototype. And meeting certain conditions in the environment results in this big rig accident becoming a reality. Bookending this slice of the game are also narrative-relevant cutscenes, with the plot seeming to be framed by a documentarian capturing footage on a film about the missing Alan Wake. And it is through this framing that we learned that rumors and speculation on Alan have evolved from basic conspiracy theories to full-on urban legends, with one of the subjects of these interviews claiming that Alan had become a psychopathic killer, and that people had seen him in the real world since his disappearance, with the prototype ending with a fairly gruesome attack on both the filmmaker and the interviewee being slain by what appears to be Alan. Even though it is fairly clear that this was the earliest depiction of actor Ilka Ville portraying Scratch in the live-action camcorder footage. The subtext here being that these rumors and tall tales about Alan were actually being utilized by the Dark Presence and manifesting in the real world as our now killer Mr. Scratch. And while the Night Springs episodes, an anthology show in the world of Alan Wake which acts as a pretty clear analog for the Twilight Zone, these shows in Alan Wake were shot as live-action shorts juxtaposed against the in-engine graphics of the original title. But this sequence here, it showcases the first time in Remedy's history where they had filmed one of their lead actors and seamlessly meshed this footage against their computer-generated cutscenes. It is really slick stuff, and it showcases an early iteration of Remedy's desire to blend different media into their presentation. And it really makes me wonder just how hard they would have gone outside of the scale of just this early demo. But like I said before, this prototype, it didn't move the needle enough to result in an actual sequel. And you might be questioning, what does this prototype have to do with Alan Wake's American Nightmare? And there is a fairly simple answer to that. A lot of what we see here in this lost 2010 prototype, it eventually found its way into 2012's release of American Nightmare. This title was initially released on the digital-only Xbox Live Arcade platform, and while digital-only purchases are more or less the norm nowadays, Xbox Live Arcade games had not yet reached the same size and scope as the standard digital releases that you see today. Geometry Wars, Castle Crashers, or even something with a little bit more mainstream appeal like Far Cry Blood Dragon, Xbox Live Arcade was usually seen as a platform for smaller scale titles and indie projects, as digital distribution was still very much in its early days when it came to the consoles in particular. With the planned sequel failing to get off the ground, Remedy found themselves in a bit of a bind, at least creatively, with the team completely geared up to make Alan Wake 2. And while Microsoft passed on the sequel, the corporation was making its rounds looking for smaller titles to pad out its arcade lineup. The label had done extremely well for Microsoft, especially with a great deal of its biggest successes in this initiative coming from the indie scene. And as of 2008, Microsoft rolled out an annual showcase for its digital distribution platform called Summer of Arcade, a promotional event of sorts in which they would showcase a few of these smaller titles in hopes of getting gamers to exchange their hard-earned cash for Microsoft points in order to cop some of these must-have titles, with some heavy hitters of this release cycle including Braid, Shadow Complex, Limbo, and Bastion. But as the success of this platform continued to grow and as more projects were greenlit with this smaller scope as their shared philosophy, Microsoft began to push other initiatives throughout the year. And for the first quarter of 2012, Microsoft was looking for a lineup of arcade games for an event that they would call the Xbox Live House Party. At this point, Remedy had done some basic design work for this prototype, but in studio they had also programmed an arcade-styled wave-based survival mode based off of the Doom sequel's updated combat engine. And this game type was modeled after similar popular modes as seen with Gears of War 2's Horde mode and Call of Duty World at War's Nazi Zombie mode. And not wanting their hard work to go to waste, Remedy pitched this Horde mode take on Alan Wake to Xbox for their arcade label. However, in true Remedy fashion, this small arcade diversion eventually grew to include a single-player campaign that more or less acted as a follow-up to Alan Wake proper, utilizing a lot of the settings and ideas that we saw in the prototype. And with this smaller-scale title, Remedy released American Nightmare just in time for 2012's House Party event, alongside Trapdoor's Warp, Ilphonic's Nexia's, and Ubisoft's I Am Alive, with promotional material giving the marquee spot to American Nightmare. And although this 2012 release did lend itself to a smaller scope and more arcade-friendly gameplay, Remedy did not rest on its laurels and continued to showcase not only their signature style of action combat, but also the next iteration of their evolving trademark cross-media storytelling. So with all that said, what is Alan Wake's American Nightmare? Starting from the single-player campaign perspective, the plot framing here is fairly nuanced with a fair bit of abstraction. American Nightmare starts with the camera panning over the Cardinal Motel located somewhere in Arizona, which should be instantly familiar to anyone who has now seen the Alan Wake 2 prototype, as this asset was clearly recycled. In front of the building is a tour bus for the old gods of Asgard, and the camera zooms into one of the rooms through an unobscured window, as a television set powers on, seemingly on its own, illuminating the room to show us a pretty interesting scene. Barry Wheeler is passed out, still rocking his insane outfit, complete with hiking boots, cargo shorts, and a Hawaiian shirt being covered by a thick puffer jacket. A quick flash to the corner of his bed shows that he is now the current tour manager of the old gods of Asgard, and beer bottles and empty pizza boxes, as well as the boots on the bed, show us that he has been living up the rock and roll lifestyle. But even though the TV flickered on to a dead station, eventually an episode of Night Springs starts to come into focus. And after the familiar intro, a transition is made into a full live-action production of this TV show. However, things get strange very quickly. It was stated in passing in the first game that one of Alan's earliest writing gigs was writing for this sci-fi horror anthology series, and this episode is credited as being written by the author. But in an even stranger twist, Alan seems to be the star of this particular episode. In this intro, we are introduced to a few key concepts. Alan is playing himself, navigating the dark place where we last left him, chasing down his evil double. The Night Springs narrator, who is doing a Dead to Rights Rod Serling impression.
The man before you is a champion of light.
Adam Grant, a nondescript kind of man found guilty of murder and sentenced to the electric chair.
Introduces us to our protagonist as the Champion of Light, and Scratch as the Herald of Darkness, with this concept eventually being expanded upon further in one of Alan Wake 2's more out there moments. But most importantly, in terms of setting the tone for what Remedy has only built upon since this game, this live action sequence is the first time where the studio chose to forego computer generated cutscenes, instead using the live action talents of both men who have brought Alan to life. Finnish actor Ilkka Ville as the actor portraying the author, and Matthew Peretta giving Alan his voice.
And what's the deal with the Hadron resonance anyway?
And they both work together to bring this character into a completely new dimension.
I'll catch you eventually!
Maybe. But what are you gonna do then? By then, I'll have had my hands on everything you love.
Sure, it had been done briefly in the Microsoft-released prequel series Bright Falls a few years earlier, but this is the first time where Remedy committed to this mixed media approach to enhance their storytelling. And even with this just being a small glimpse into the technique and an even smaller glimpse into what it would ultimately become in Remedy's creative output over the next decade, you can already see this team swinging for the fences. As Alan moves through the dark place, you can see the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness as it dances and wisps around him, with this surrealist landscape clearly being completely computer generated. It sets the tone for this game immediately. And even though this is ultimately a smaller scale entry in the Alan Wake series, the production here was clearly trying to do the most with what little resources they had. After a brief conflict between the Champion of Light and the Herald of Darkness, Scratch manipulates the darkness surrounding Alan and blasts him back with the power of the Dark Presence. And after the screen fades to black, we return to Alan face down in the dirt, and the game transitions from this live action sequence back into the actual game engine. And it is here where the game proper starts. Alan finds himself washed ashore in what now appears to be the Arizona desert, with the wreckage of the Bird Lake cabin from the first game sinking into the darkness behind him. But the TV narrator is still here and notifies the viewer, or in this case the player, that Alan has found himself here for a decisive battle.
The man has been brutally spat out from the darkness that surrounds the shores of our reality. He has come to fight a decisive battle in Night Springs.
With the here in this case being the titular town of Night Springs. I may be jumping ahead a bit here, but this framing device needs a little explanation. This game more or less takes place entirely within an episode of Night Springs, with the fictional town serving as a shorthand for Everytown USA. The fictional town of Night Springs, it actually shifts around in location based off the needs of each episode. If the episode calls for Night Springs to be in a place near the coast, then Night Springs has always been a coastal town. If Night Springs needs to be landlocked in the desert, then yes, the town has always been there too. Alan has been in the dark place since we left him at the end of the Writer DLC chapter, the epilogue for the main game. That chapter ended with Alan realizing that he was going to have to write his way back into reality, and American Nightmare is one of his countless attempts to do so. But as established in the first game, there are limitations to how Alan can rewrite reality. He can't just manipulate a typewritten page to read, and then the dark presence just went home and everyone lived happily ever after. Instead, he is up against an intelligent adversary who is also capable of manipulating reality, and as such, Alan's power is less absolute and more subtle. He needs to work with nuance, just little changes in reality. He can nudge people in the right direction, but he can't invent people. He can manipulate the causes that lead to effects, but he can't just write his own Deus Ex Machina. Think of it more as a literary Mandela effect. Alan can change little details in the background or manufacture circumstances which can change people's desires or perceptions, but he cannot bend reality to his whim wholesale. It's like for those of you who say that you remember that Shazam movie featuring Sinbad. It's not real, you're just under Alan's created delusion.
That motherfucker back there is not real!
And that is what American Nightmare ultimately is. Alan has changed the context of an episode which he had previously written in order to place Night Springs in one of the many places in the real world where the difference between reality and dreams is a little more tenuous, inserting himself in this crack between worlds for the runtime of American Nightmare. And working backwards from recent Remedy games, this is an early iteration of the overlap concept that we see fleshed out in Alan Wake 2. But Alan is only in Arizona as much as his role in this TV show allows him to be. And this plot requires Alan, the champion of light, to chase down the Herald of Darkness. Scratch can come and go between realities whenever he'd like, and he seems to be given more power whenever rumors of Alan and his disappearance are written about or even discussed. In this episode of Night Springs, as well as in the real world, Scratch has become a serial killer, lurking in the shadows, meddling in Alan's affairs from behind the scenes, and he has recently become more brazen, with his ultimate goal of taking and destroying everything that Alan holds dear. We play as Alan hot on Scratch's trail, leading him to a little truck stop town along the interstate. There is an oil derrick, an old mine shaft, and a vacant motel called the Desert Shore. But the Dark Presence, and by extension Scratch, have the ability to bend reality to their whim as well, utilizing the oil derrick to act as a spring for Taken to manifest out of. And with this persistent threat, gameplay in this title is functionally the same as Alan Wake proper. You fight with light by holding your flashlight on enemies until their shield pops, and then you use whatever you have in your arsenal to put them down. But with this game serving as something like an Alan Wake 1.5 with much more of an emphasis on the action, combat is not exactly what it was in the first game. Everything here is snappier. Shadows are burned away slightly faster, dodge windows have been widened in order to make defensive options even stronger. Sprinting is actually a fully viable option in this game compared to the pitiful little jog that Alan was capable of in the first game. And then the weaponry in this game, it definitely spices things up. Where the first game was very conscious of the believability of its kit and how it played against its setting when it came to arming the author, American Nightmare says, nah, fuck all that. Let's just make a big dick action game. The first weapon you get here is a semi-automatic 9mm, which does about as much damage as the revolver from the first game, but you can mag dump this thing with way less downtime between reloads. There is the just for fun nail gun, which functions more like a submachine gun than anything, even though you do have to take bullet or nail drop into account. And then there is an actual submachine gun that seems to be based off of a MAC-10, and then the arsenal just keeps growing from there. The old standbys are still represented, including the flare gun of course, but things get into the exotic realm when things like the crossbow or combat shotgun get thrown into the mix. And this increased firepower, or more specifically rate of fire, lend themselves to a more chaotic pace. But Alan isn't the only one getting this overhaul treatment. As the Taken, they are also far more aggressive and varied than we've ever seen them. The Birdman, even though there's only one Birdman in my eyes and this ain't him, is present and accounted for from the prototype. Splitters, Taken that split into doubles and even more copies as they are defeated join the fray. Spiders, which are stupid and simultaneously uninteresting to fight, but also as far from scary or creepy as you can get, making me wonder why they were included altogether. And then there are the Giants, which wield huge concrete saws and act more like bullet sponges than anything. They are stupid, they look out of place, but when paired up with all these new enemy types and the returning array from the first game, this combat mixes things up to the point where all the encounters are varied enough to stay interesting throughout this game's runtime. And with this game's tone being decidedly more pulpy, almost approaching grindhouse schlock at times, these encounters and combat really fit the setting and make for a much more bombastic experience. Alan Wake, the original game, it worked, with almost everything it was doing, even some of its worst parts, being in service of that game's atmosphere and characterization, with Sam Lake specifically wanting the author to feel less like a one-man army and more like a fish out of water. But here, with the power of fiction, God, and anime at his side, Alan is a one-man wrecking crew. And while it wouldn't be fair to instantly compare these two experiences as they are both servicing completely different ends, it is hard not to point out that this game, from a moment-to-moment and encounter perspective, it just feels way better to play. And it's not just with the combat. American Nightmare is a much smaller and tighter experience, taking maybe 4 or so hours to see everything in the single-player campaign compared to the 20 or so hours it took to see all of Alan Wake Remastered's content, of which I'm including both DLC chapters. And this short experience is designed in such a way to always keep you bopping along at a steady clip. When we look back at the first game, it had a stupid amount of collectibles, with most of them being pointless coffee thermoses. But when it came to expanding the narrative and getting the full picture, manuscript pages were easily the most interesting thing to collect. And while a great deal of them were fairly easy to spot, there were quite a few that required rubbing against the walls looking for hidden outcrops in a landscape that could at best be described as samey looking and at their worst, crawling with infinitely spawning enemies. American Nightmare skips this problem with 2 simple but effective solutions. One is environment design. This game takes place in 3 distinct openish districts. You have the motel and its surroundings, an observatory for the second act, and a drive-in movie theater serving as the setting for the third act, making them a lot easier to scour when compared to the 20th stretch of woods surrounding Bright Falls, with a lot of these collectibles being peppered into the more visually interesting sections of each map. But the main thing that most players will notice is this game's radar of sorts. The first game had a little objective indicator at the top of the screen, but American Nightmares is a little more functional, pointing out ammo supply boxes, objectives, and safe havens. But it will also occasionally blip a small question mark indicator whenever Alan is close to one of the manuscript pages. And while this certainly isn't the most elegant solution, as it makes the HUD a little more fugly this time around, it does aid the player in finding these manuscript pages, which offer up key insight into this increasingly complicated narrative. And as a personal matter of opinion, I fuck with this choice heavy. Not just because I want all the plot relevant information, but also because this time around, manuscript pages are even more interesting than they were in the first game. With the Night Springs narrator doing a lot of Alan's job of laying on the exposition, the manuscript pages here are more personal, less spoilery, even though there are still some that are certainly that way, and they are presented in the same way that we saw in the prototype, meaning that they are shot in that more dynamic way.
Been 2 years since I came here. Being that long without Alice breaks my heart, and I know it broke hers. I know she thinks I'm dead. How could I blame her for that? It would be a crime to pretend that she owes me anything. She took all the stupid, self-indulgent bullshit I brought into her life and still stood by me. Still loved me. It's no betrayal. But I'm a better person now than I used to be. I want to be that person with her.
And then these play into the action-focused part of the game by rewarding players with unlockable weapons when enough of these pages have been collected, as strange black boxes which can be found in the environment only open up when enough of these collectibles have been gathered. And then finally, the pages function in a very similar way to what we saw in the prototype, with some key pages acting as instructions for rewriting reality. But I'll get back to that in a bit. But with the Night Springs narrator doing the heavy lifting for the exposition this time around, we do find ourselves in a slightly tricky situation in terms of design philosophy. I outlined in the last video how Sam Lake was very cognizant and annoyed by a weird thing that can happen in video games sometimes. And that is when a main character in a video game has to communicate something to the player, and it just ends up with the character just rambling to themselves.
Glowing lights. This must be the Zenith base. Looks like they have a shield around the entire place. Of course, they'd make their base on their own private island.
And while Max Payne used his voiceover to capture a film noir trope, and the first Alan Wake avoided that pitfall by utilizing the manuscript pages as a framing device, here with the narrator taking Alan's role, there was a moment or two where Alan would just speak to himself.
It's gonna be like that again, huh?
Again, he enters the world, but now he sees the trap for what it is. A maze that loops back into itself.
I'm here again. He sent me back.
And I don't know, just looking back, it felt very unRemedy. I know it's kind of a funny thing to notice, and maybe it's more of a nitpick than anything. Picking up where we left off with Alan on Scratch's trail and being jumped by the denizens of the derrick, Alan makes his way to the Desert Shore Motel. Here he meets Emma Sloan, the first of 3 female co-stars in this game, with each of the 3 levels introducing a new lady for Alan to shoot the shit with, before they ultimately give Alan each of the chapter's mandatory manuscript pages. And these lay out the conditions for changing the scene and advancing the action. Here in the town near Desert Shore, the conditions are for destroying the oil derrick and putting an end to the spawning Taken. And these instructions entail going on a bit of a scavenger hunt before going to a set location and then manipulating the scene in order for it to correspond with what's on the page. You know, more or less what we were introduced to in the prototype. Once you meet these conditions, simple things like turning on a radio or opening a valve lead to far more surreal consequences. In this instance, these little actions set up a chain of events that leads to an orbiting satellite above Arizona being struck by an asteroid, causing the man-made device to careen into the oil derrick below. And all this is played out as an action escape set piece set to Kasabian's Clubfoot song, which may have been a really cool moment back in 2012, but now here in 2024, it comes across as pretty silly, maybe even a little stupid. And given recent developments with Tom Meehan being forced to step down as the frontman for the band after he admitted to assault allegations against his then fiancée, it makes this scene just feel especially dated. But this just seems to be the risk when dealing with licensed media. After this escape, Emma then puts us on the trail of Mr. Scratch, after Alan explains a bit of the current happenings to the young woman, and although she is understandably confused by everything, she does seem to understand that there is truth in what the writer is saying. And between this interaction with Emma and the other leading ladies in this game, and through some introspection found in some of the manuscript pages, we see that being stuck in the dark place for the last 2 years, while an awful fate to be sure, it has softened Alan.
Listen, what's this all about? There are these really creepy guys hanging around the oil derricks. There's something really weird about them.
They're dangerous. I'm gonna deal with them. Try to stay out of their sight, okay? And stay in the light. They hate the light.
He seems to genuinely care about others far more than he did in his first outing, and he seems humbled by everything that he's gone through. And when you compare him to how he was in the first game, this Alan, he is decidedly much less of a dick.
Did you talk to my wife?
I had the pleasure of discussing your situation with her on several occasions.
Did you set something up with her?
I invited her here. My clinic is a place where...
And this is especially contrasted by this game's portrayal of Mr. Scratch. You see the carnage that he has been wreaking as you follow in his path. But where the first title had TVs that you could stumble upon in the environments tuned into the Night Springs episodes, TVs located in this game's 3 environments play back camcorder filmed shorts of Mr. Scratch. And Scratch, he and the 2 actors working to bring him to life, they've really been on that Sigma grind set, because the charismatic psychopath has some real Patrick Bateman vibes. Each of these little recordings show Mr. Scratch antagonizing Alan, usually in the middle of some heinous act.
Okay. So this chick just came up to me and said she's my biggest fan. I know. They all say that, right? And she's giving me the eye. So I make a couple of moves. We have a couple of drinks. And then things start happening. But I say I have to go to the bathroom first. She's got no idea. Watch this. This is gonna be priceless.
And it is uncertain, at least for me at this time, if these clips are always taking place in the fictional Night Springs universe, or if he is indeed killing some of these people while wearing Alan's flesh out in the real world, with the latter seeming just as possible. And that is the structure for the storytelling in American Nightmare. Follow Mr. Scratch's path, meet a new woman to talk to and guide you towards your goal, fight enemies, find manuscript pages, get antagonized by Scratch, satisfy the narrative beats you need to meet in order to advance the story, and then trigger the next reality-bending sequence. But this structure does have a trick up its sleeve, and it does come as a bit of a surprise on the first playthrough. Your trip through the Desert Shore and its surrounding town, it ends with you hot on the trail of Scratch, but Emma Sloan is killed by the Taken. Upon your first visit to the second stage, the observatory, you go on a scavenger hunt to get a telescope array working again in order to help Dr. Rachel Meadows interpret a strange signal that she has been intercepting from outer space. Apparently Scratch had met with her just before your arrival, and she found him to be charming at first, but upon reading what the signal had to say, he dismantled her equipment. So you help her fix it, and then you find out that you don't have the full transmission. But then you are set on your way to meet Scratch, who appears to be waiting for you and a showdown of sorts at a nearby drive-in theater. Here you meet Serena Valdivia, the curator for the drive-in, but things seem pretty off with her seemingly corrupted by the darkness that Mr. Scratch touched her with. and she is more or less sitting alone in the dark waiting for him to come back, but more on this interaction later. After getting her back to normal by returning the power to the outdoor theater, Serena tells you that Mr. Scratch was last seen by the projector booth, but then she also talks to you a little bit about how she knows Alice, and she's surprised to see you because according to Alice and the rest of the world, Alan is believed to be dead. After this weird interaction, you follow Scratch towards the projector booth, and once inside, Alan uses the incomplete transmission from space. Remember, Alan wrote this story, okay? And after changing the room around to match the description, darkness floods the room, and Alan is returned to the dark place where he was when this episode first tuned in. And while things play out slightly different, the outcome is the same. And Alan is returned to the beginning of this loop back in Arizona. And this is the true structure of the game. It is a Groundhog Day kind of setup. But the difference here is that Alan's co-stars, they have some vague recollection of the events of each go-around, even if they are not entirely sure of the particulars.
Wow, it is you. I guess all of it really happened.
You remember me?
Kind of. I felt weird all day, like I could almost remember a dream I had, and then just before sunset, I remembered the page.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go get those things again.
Not all of them. I went out and got them.
And with this feeling of deja vu and anticipation, all three of them do small favors of moving the outcome into a slightly different direction. We visit each of these locations 3 times in this game, but each time enemies change, the objectives get streamlined, with Emma and Rachel helping out with each chapter's scavenger hunt while waiting for Alan to show up, new manuscript pages are sprinkled in, new Scratch recordings are added, and unlockable weapons that you couldn't access on the first or even second go around become available. But when it comes to the narrative, each chapter has its own little subplot. For the Desert Shore, Alan needs to figure out how to break the oil derrick and track down Scratch, but he also needs to figure out a way to save Emma by his third pass. The subplot with Rachel at the observatory is to get the complete transmission from outer space, you know, normal stuff. And for the drive-in theater, it is to stop Scratch by playing a short film shot by Alice Wake after having access to the full transmission and allowing day to break on Night Springs, concluding the episode. And as a quick little aside on Alice's video, it's pretty short, so I'll just run it here in its entirety.
Alan? Is it really you?
It's really me.
How? I love you.
I love you.
This clip is something that Alice shot of Alan before his disappearance, and as the day breaks in the clip, Mr. Scratch is seemingly killed off as it brings with it a new day. And as the clip rolls, the Alan that she filmed back in the day is replaced with the Alan that we've been playing as. And even though this does kind of feel like a happy ending, it is really nothing more than a projection that Alan is able to watch for just a brief moment, potentially going as far as to experience it all over again, but it is not real. Just a plot beat from this episode tampered with by our author in an attempt to find his way out of the dark place. And while this is not something that is able to change his fate, we do get some insight in how the dark place works, and we also get some insight into Alice as a character throughout this game. But while this is not something that is able to change Alan's fate, we do get some insight into Alice as a character throughout this game, and although it is brief, she is developed far more here than all of her appearances in the main game combined. And this is done not only through this film that she's made, but also through Eddie Rodman's radio show.
Well, here you are, about to enjoy another cool Arizona night with me, Eddie Rodman, the host with the boast.
The first game had an analog to this with Pat Maine's broadcast, where callers would talk about the strange happenings in Bright Falls. But here, Eddie's show is either bleeding in from the real world, or possibly Alan is influencing the real world through this bleed. And it is here that we are given a few recordings of Alice Wake talking about her missing husband, their relationship, and also her attempts of taking her talent as a photographer and trying to transfer it over into film with this little project. She is joined by Serena Valdivia from the Drive-In in these broadcasts, who is planning on showcasing the project at a local film festival.
Yes, exactly. So I'm really used to thinking of the world in terms of snapshots. I frame something and try to pick the right moment, and then reveal that moment to people. Moving images are a different story. I'm still learning a lot about it, to be honest.
So this is a new thing for you?
Or maybe I'm just a slow learner.
When compared to her portrayal in the first game, essentially just Alan's muse and a damsel in distress, with her fear of the dark meddling in Alan's affairs, and certain other assets being her defining characteristics, this is a version of the character that shows some real growth, even if it is coming at the cost of having to come to terms with the fact that she believes her husband to be dead.
Well, yes, I can understand that. It features your husband, and he's, well...
He's dead.
I thought he was missing.
It's been 2 years. This sounds awful, but yes, I believe he's dead.
You can tell she's hurting, she's acknowledging the good and the bad times with Alan, and she is trying to move forward in the only way that she knows how. And even though this version of the character won't pass the Bechdel test, as she is always in some way talking about Alan, it is certainly moving her development forward in a way that doesn't feel as mired in the pre-Gamergate schlock that we saw in the first game. Barry is also featured on this radio show, and we learn about his transition from Alan's manager to becoming the manager for the old rockers from the first game, the Old Gods of Asgard. And Barry is enjoying this role immensely, and even becoming a bit of a producer as it turns out, helping the band release their first new single in years, Balance Slays the Demon, which we can hear both here on the radio, but also pumped into the gameplay during one of the climactic battles. And this track, written by Poets of the Fall again, moonlighting as the Old Gods, it seems to have a hidden message written into it by Sam Lake, but more on that in just a bit. And really, in terms of single-player content, that is the vast majority of what is here. There also is a final post-credits cutscene, and I'll just let it run here since it's real short.
No. Al?
But yeah, that's American Nightmare. So how does it expand upon the first game? Or maybe, as a less interesting question, how does it stack up when compared to the original Alan Wake? And that is a tricky question. Clearly this is not on the same scale as 2010's release. It uses recycled environments, 3 times in a 4-hour runtime, so you see these spots pretty often. Its plot is streamlined, and it feels much more like a taste of things to come, or how I interpreted its story back when I first played it in 2012, like a satisfactory enough ending in case more Alan Wake wasn't on the horizon. And after Sam Lake's announcement of Quantum Break back in 2013, where he said that Alan Wake 2 was not something that was going to be happening for the foreseeable future, this felt even more the case. But this side story of sorts fleshes out all the key characters, except for Thomas Zane, who is only referenced in the smallest way possible. Kind of weird, but okay. And it shows us Alan in his attempts to escape the dark place, and how he is beginning to understand how he can utilize his abilities to manipulate it. The actual plot with its time loop approach is fairly goofy, even though this concept of loops is definitely expanded upon by the time that we get to Alan Wake 2.
It's not a loop. It's a spiral.
But more on that in the final video of this series. But this goofiness is fine when it is confined to this rewritten TV show framing device. And this lower stakes vibe carries over to the gameplay, which, once you get over the tonal whiplash, surpasses the first game in terms of raw playability by a fairly wide margin. It is just that this method of storytelling, this time loop thing, it betrays this game's budget quite a bit, as it is clear that the team didn't have the resources to develop something that moved Alan for a full runtime. And these recycled assets, they stop wowing the player long before the second loop is even complete. If there are any true pitfalls when it comes to this game, it is this recycled nature, its brevity, stupid Kasabian song, and in the way that it almost comes out on top of showcasing that Remedy had fully matured when it came to their writing, but also fumbling it in some key ways. In the first game, Alan was a dick, and Remedy's writing when it came to its female cast left something to be desired. Alice was kind of a nothing character, just serving as motivation and as cheap eye candy if this is your kind of thing. Barbara Yeager was Tom's equivalent of Alice, but he had to cut out her heart, which was fairly gruesome. Cynthia Weaver was obsessed with Tom, and Rose was obsessed with Alan, with only Sarah Breaker seeming to have any real agency of her own. When it comes to American Nightmare, this game showcases a much more humbled and kinder Alan. He has learned from his time in solitude. Alice is shown to be something more than a damsel, and this game sets up her development for the future Remedy titles where she is shown to have grown in some major ways. And even 1.5 of these leading ladies here are treated much better than they would have been if they were in the first game. Emma is a mechanic, and her backstory goes to show that she is very respected in her community, and she goes out of her way not only to help Alan but also save the player from having to slog through some fetch quests. And her other details, such as being into some new age shit, while pretty scant, make her out to be a pretty cool side character. Dr. Rachel is the reason that I said half, and I'm mostly kidding when I bring her up, as she is a pretty no-nonsense character that gives you all the information that you would expect from a woman of her expertise. But when the conversation with Alan starts off as all business and then devolves to this for no reason,
I have to ask, do you always wear that to work?
It does bring up some questions about Remedy's design philosophy here. These women, Emma, Rachel, and Serena, they are clearly designed with a mostly young male demographic in mind, but they are not over-sexualized in any real way, or at least in any way that should be taken too seriously. And with this meta-narrative effectively making them stars in a cheesy science fiction anthology show, even less so. So Alan bringing this up, it feels more like, well, Remedy designed her this way, or even Alan wrote her this way, but now we are bringing it to the forefront for what reason? You can almost feel the self-awareness here. But they decided to see it through. It's a little weird, but I don't really care enough to explore it any deeper than I have here. But Serena, I'll just roll the clip.
Oh, it's you. That's fantastic.
Are you okay?
Go away. No, I want you. But you'll get angry if you're here. So, you gotta go. You know I'll do what you want.
Okay.
I love you so much. Did you know that love hurts? Are you gonna hurt me now? 'Cause you should. You're here now, and you're in my head. You should be in me. You should touch me again.
She was glamored or some shit by Scratch, a power that Remedy seems to have ditched in a post-Alan Wake 2 world, and more or less turned into this over-sexualized proto-concubine. And at least for me, it just felt, I don't know, I guess the best word for it would be cringe, and the fact that this was seemingly mocapped or even worse hand animated, it just betrays that same horniness that we were exposed to when Alice's musorific booty was brought up. And this character, I don't know, it just seems like she kind of got this shit into the stick. But like I said in the first Alan Wake video, this is not an indictment of Remedy or anything, and I'm not going to act like this portrayal offended me. It just feels like growing pains more than anything. And with the next video, a video on Control, I think it will come into clear view how much this team has changed over the years when it comes to their writing. American Nightmare is a short but super important stepping stone on the path towards Alan Wake 2. It gave us insight into how the Dark Place works, it introduced us to this champion of light motif, it gave us a dope first look into the full extent of what Remedy would soon make their trademark visual style with their mixed media approach, and it gave us the earliest iteration of what would become the writing mechanic in Alan Wake 2. Before coming back to play this game for the first time in a decade, and after playing the remaster version of the first game, which it is a shame that American Nightmare wasn't included in that package because there are now people questioning whether or not this game is canon, and this decision seems to be based more around tech than anything, with Lake stating that the engine in the second game was so different that it would require its own separate release when questioned on its absence. But after playing 2010's game again, and ultimately finding myself happy with it, but just a little less impressed than I was when I first played it back in the day, here in American Nightmare, I had the opposite experience. Playing the game was a joy, and even poking around with the arcade mode, while just a little fun diversion more than anything, it continued to showcase how solid this game's combat felt. The world building and presentation felt like a solid step in Remedy's evolution, and little details that I had forgotten kept flooding back in such a way that made this game feel just so much more important to the overall narrative than I had originally remembered. It may be locked to the Xbox platform as far as consoles go at this point, but if you are a Remedy fan and you have one of Microsoft's machines, or a PC for that matter, you owe it to yourself to check out this little side story. Let's just hope that as time goes on, it doesn't find itself as the forgotten chapter in this franchise. But before we wrap up this video and move on to Control in the next, I'd like to leave you with this hidden message found in Balance Slays the Demon by the Old Gods of Asgard. If you play a section towards the end of that song backwards, it leaves you with this.
It will happen again in another town.
And if you know, you know. And if you don't know, tune in next time. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It is always greatly appreciated. And if you liked the video, please consider dropping a like, commenting, or even subscribing. This channel is actually closing in on its first big milestone of 1,000 subscribers. So if you want to see more videos like this, please click that button. Going back to Alan Wake's American Nightmare was definitely way more fun than I was expecting. What I had first just remembered as just a little side story ended up having so much more context to the overall narrative, and I'm glad that I went back and checked this out for this series. Control is next, and if that's your thing, please meet me in the next video. But until then, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.